Hey, Mike, great to see you again.
Great to see you as well, and I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, I'm excited too. We were just chatting before we hit record here, and I'm grateful, Mike, that you brought in an interesting topic for us to jam on today around polarity.
Yes.
And what straight away came into my mind was this idea of polarity that's one of the Hermetic principles. So the Hermetic principles are kind of an interesting thing. So it's seven principles, and so they're sort of traced back to some sort of form of ancient wisdom. But there's a few questions around where it actually came from and what it means. But I would really encourage people to have a look and do a little Google and see what the seven principles are. But one of them is the principle of polarity. So I'd love to open up this conversation with you today, Mike, and I'll just read out the principle itself, and then I'll throw it over to you and see what comes up.
Mm-hmm.
So the principle of polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths, and all paradoxes may be reconciled.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big one, a lot in there. I'd love to know where you'd like to begin with polarity.
Yeah. So the first thing that sparked up for me, have you ever seen the movie Inside Out?
Doesn't ring a bell.
It's a Disney Pixar movie, and it tells the story of a girl who moved from, I think it was her beloved Minnesota, to California, and her inner world, they do in a very simplistic way, but in a magnificent way as well. It it has happy, sad, disgust, anger, fear as the brain control panel who are operating at all
Oh,
times.
yeah.
And what it stirs for me is, I think, one of, spoiler alert by the way if you haven't seen the movie, but one of the profound moments of the movie is when sadness finds its place, and happiness and joy realizes, oh, I can't exist as well without sadness. Sadness has a really powerful utility, meaning I want to be sad when if I lose a loved one, or if I move away and all these memories are created. Sadness can help point us to, yeah, this really matters to me. This is something that's important. And joy can't possibly exist on the other pole, at least not as well, without sadness. And most of us spend a lot of our life, in my experience, trying to just flex on the things that we identify with. Like, we just want to be joyful, we want to be calm, we want to be, or these are things that at least come up for me a lot: joyful, calm, easygoing. And we don't want to admit that the other poles are also in us too. And I think, to be an integrated, dynamic, and whole human, we have to claim all of these parts of ourselves. There are parts of me that are impatient. There are parts of me that lash out and throw a whiny temper tantrum if I'm in traffic or if I don't get my way. And so, yeah, what comes up for you? I'll pause there, because I think a lot of polarity work is, how can we integrate all of this into us?
Yeah, I love that. Just as you're describing the characters, I remember I have actually seen that movie quite a while ago, so I'm not so good at remembering the plots and the details of these things. But yeah, I remember the little characters jumping around. Yeah, it's so interesting, and I just really want to commend you as well, just in in your language, the way that you speak to that, like bringing it back to I. I always have this tendency to speak to we. It's like, no,
Yeah.
I. So
Uh-huh.
no, I notice the same in myself. Thank you for reminding me to anchor it for me as well. I definitely notice that I have a tendency, particularly with things like being stressed or frustrated or angry. It's like, yeah, that's not okay. It's like my
Yeah.
identity as a person is, I'm nice, I'm kind, I'm balanced, whatever it might be. So when you reach these other places, it's like, that's wrong. There's this labeling that happens. But I love this principle of polarity, because it kind of, as you say, it brings it back to this sort of idea of wholeness. There is an integration that needs to happen. It's like everything is necessary. And I find it super interesting the way that it's framed inside this Hermetic principle. It's like they're the same, but different in degree.
Yes.
And I have to think as well about the idea that fear and excitement are the same kind of energy as well, that there's a similar energetic sort of stamp on those two experiences. So that feels like an interesting polarity to look at as well. Like excitement, real sort of strong anticipation for the future. Whereas fear is more like, I don't want this future to play out.
Yeah.
Like something bad's got to happen. Both of them are labels, right, about something that hasn't happened yet, so you can't really know the outcome of. But it's the same energetic kind of fingerprint that's on those. So I feel like that's kind of polarity at play to some extent.
Yeah. And fear is a great one to bring in, because that's another one that historically has always been very present for me, but that I rejected in myself or looked at as a quality that I needed to eradicate, that I needed to completely get rid of and silo. And before we hit record, I was also saying, what would be a word that you could say that would really poke me? And that's a good part of the work to do around polarity. And I said awkward. And awkward and fearful are two words that carry a lot of charge for me. And so in the space of a coaching conversation, what my coach might do with me, or what I would invite a client to do if they were working with me, would be something along the lines of saying, I am awkward and that is okay. And just seeing what happens in my body when I say that. And there's still a little bit of a clenching. So typical things that might happen if we reject the quality in ourselves and try and take ownership at first. A, it feels clunky and like a total lie, so we don't really believe it about ourselves. And B, we might start breathing more shallowly. I might feel more tightness. When I said I am awkward and that's okay, I could feel a little constriction in my chest. It's harder to have natural flow of energy and breathing through me. Whereas if I said the opposite, we'll say charming. I am charming and that is okay. That carries no charge for me, because I have the belief that that's a beautiful thing and that being awkward is a bad thing. And a lot of what polarity work does is it invites us into none of these qualities are inherently good or bad. It is the meaning that we are making about these qualities. So how can we, in the example of awkward, it would be, how can I befriend that part of me that is still awkward, that gets really scared? What's the fear? What does the fear want me to know? All might be questions that I would ask myself to start to cozy up to it and bring it more into my life. Because the thing that happens if we don't is that it starts to leak out in other ways anyway, and it's unconscious instead of conscious.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Just as you're talking, I get this image in my head that there's kind of like a house that we live in, like our internal experience, and something like fear or this idea of, say being awkward or, whatever the thing might be. It's like there's a room in the house that's got a locked door. Nobody goes in there.
It's in the attic.
Yeah, or an attic or something. And it's like, no, don't go in there. Like, we've got to avoid that at all costs. And it's like this process of exploring that is a little bit like kind of going in there, with a flashlight, checking it all out, making sure there's nothing creepy in there. Like there's no ghosts, there's nobody sleeping out there, nobody that's going to hurt you. It's an unfamiliar space. It's like something that's unknown. And so I think there's so much power in actually venturing into that and exploring that polarity. And it's like, okay, well, who am I? I relate to that awkwardness one as well. It's like, who am I? Who am I if I experience awkwardness? If I'm in a situation where I'm feeling like, oh, like I'm kind of the weird one here. Like I'm different, whatever the narrative is that goes around it. It's like, can I sit in that? Can I just be awkward? Can I be okay with that?
Yeah.
And I know for me, like even just talking through it now, it's like, oh, like it feels better and better the more that you just sit in it and go, yeah, can I be in an experience of awkwardness and make that okay for myself? And I think we really can. And it's going to be more or less challenging for different things that we confront. And I think, yeah, really just going there and getting familiar, I think, is a big part of it.
Yeah. I love the imagery of the house there, and the parts that we maybe historically have segmented or said these are not okay, just they're in the attic or they're locked behind some door, but they're also, you didn't say this, but I also got the image of they're really knocking hard at that door, because they're not going anywhere. They want to be known, and they're here to teach us something. A couple of things came up for me as you were saying that, because on one hand, there's, on the belief level and the mindset level, I think there's a reframe that we can do around one of the words that you said is I'm different. And I've always had that belief too, that I'm even more than different, I'm fundamentally flawed because I'm different. And so if I were to reframe and say, what if the exact opposite were true? Meaning, for me, what if being different is one of the best things about you? Or what if being awkward is a distinguishing excellent quality about you? I might go, I've never thought about it that way, and be invited into the possibility that, for example, a lot of my favorite movie characters are the ones who they tell the tale of an awkward high school student who finds their way, and they maybe are the creative type, the trailblazer, someone who's marching to the beat of their own drum. And I go, oh, that's a little bit me. And so there's a little bit of a starting of that reclaiming. And as I zoom out, I'm also thinking of maybe different qualities that I think could be helpful and useful to invite into the conversation around polarity, because in the world of the workplace, so for example, now I'm making this about organizations, but I'll come back to the human. There is a lot of things I hear about organizations and workplaces are that they're either too bureaucratic and they're too rigid and have too much structure, or it's too chaotic and there's not enough structure. There's too much individuation and no one knows what the hell they're supposed to be doing. So at that level, it's how can we do the dance back and forth? Like what's great about bureaucracy, right? It's nice to have processes, structures, but when you go all the way down into too bureaucratic, too corporate, you become rigid and unflexible, and there's lack of creativity. And then on the other end, if you go way too far to individual, like let's just lean hard on creativity, then people might not have clarity on what their role is or what the objective is that they're working towards. So how can we hold bureaucratic and autonomous together on that level? And there's also, like, if you bring that back down to the individual level, I might be trying to do too much with this answer, actually. I'm going to pause. What happens for you after all that?
You're welcome to keep going as well. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. I'm noticing there's something in me that automatically wants to take it to the individual level, because I think that in some way, looking at organizations and the way that they approach things is somewhat representative of how an individual approaches things. And the same can be said for, country, continent, the civilization in general. I think it's so interesting to see those sort of reflections, and just the way that you're describing it as well. I wasn't sure if we're going to go there today, but I'm going to bring it in anyway, at the risk of putting some noses out of joint maybe. But the masculine feminine thing, because something that's really sort of bureaucratic to me is very kind of over-engineered and very masculine, very rigid, very focused on control. And then the other hand, that creativity, that's something that, talking esoteric terms, not gender here, but it's more feminine, it's flowing, it's nurturing. And I really don't think either of those can exist in a healthy way on their own. They need each other. It's like, this glass of water here. if I just had the water and not the glass, like it's pretty useless. It's going to be just all over the ground. If I have the glass and no water in it, I'm going to go thirsty. So you need both, being the masculine, being the representation of the container, the chalice, if you want to be a little bit poetic, and then the water is the flowing feminine. So I think it's such an interesting thing to look at, and it's actually the first thing that comes up for me with polarity. I know we can get into some dangerous waters there because people think that means man, woman, male, female, but it really doesn't. It's speaking to the type of energy with which you approach something. That's the way that it moves me.
Yeah. I love that example, because what I'm hearing is, when fully integrated, you can realize that the two poles actually support each other in a lot of ways. That structure actually supports creativity and vice versa. And they don't exist nearly as well without the other. And it doesn't become about or rather, it doesn't become which one of these qualities is better. It's which one of these is more useful in this context that I'm in, which is where that's why this work is so valuable. It helps to build more dynamism, right? It helps us to realize, yeah, we're both of these things. It just depends on the time and the place, the context, the circumstances. If we are just a hammer that's always looking for nails, sometimes people don't want the hammer. And the most obvious example of that is when someone is venting or processing feelings. We don't want to be told how to fix it, right? That's a very masculine approach to things, is to say, just brighten up, everything's gonna be okay, you're gonna be fine. Here are some things that could be really helpful, instead of what might be called for in that moment is, hey, like, I get it, that sounds really hard. That's hard, that might be pain, whatever. An attempt at empathy and connection might be more useful. Whereas other times you need to be the hammer, you need to be getting things done. So it is that dance of how can we do both, and what are maybe the slippery slopes that we might go on when we know I'm leaning too hard into creativity, I need more structure, or I'm too rigid. An example that's coming up for me, when I first started getting into personal development work, I was so into everything. If I was very much subscribing to, if it's not on your calendar, it's not going to happen. So I wanted to schedule time for play. Like, this is the time that I'm going to allow myself to be more joyful and playful in this allotted time that I have. And I actually think that sometimes that could be useful, just to give yourself the space of, yeah, this is where I'm gonna. But my come from was very much, I need to structure every moment of my entire day, and there's no room for any space at all. And I was too rigid at that point, so that would have called for more creativity. Versus on the other extreme, when I first started venturing into part-time work, I've invited this into other Cultivating Courage conversations that we've had, but I might look at the blank calendar, and one part of me would be like, yeah, that's great, you created so much space. But then there's also, well, there's no container around what am I supposed to be doing here? So a really obvious example, people that are prolific writers usually block off, here's 2 hours that I'm going to write, or here's an hour that I'm going to write, and just get the words down. And it's within that hour, you've given yourself the container to be creative. They don't exist without each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I love those real examples. The word that stood out for me as you were talking through this is the word dynamic. Yeah. And I think that's a really, really important point when you're looking at polarity, because it's having that capacity to explore both of them. Like, I dare say that you're a better planner because you've known what it's like to have every moment scheduled, and you've also known what it feels like to have so much spaciousness. And you get to sort of move between the two and feel into it and go, well, what actually works? What actually gets you the results that you want to achieve in a certain amount of time? Or when I say results, it could be a state as well. And it could be what actually makes you feel good and alive and growing and expansive. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, clearing out your to-do lists. But I think really practicing moving between the polarity whether it's, masculine and feminine, or whether it's, well, like, what place am I coming from sort of energetically today? Like, is it something that's sort of motivated by fear or anxiety, or is it something that is really joyful and, moving towards pleasure? I think it's really important. And maybe just a little anecdote from myself as well. I notice that sometimes I can also get a little bit sucked into making life very sort of structured and rigid. It tends to happen when I get a little bit busier and sort of the safety mechanisms kick in, and I almost find it hard to sort of peel myself away from my work. And so I get conscious of that, because I start feeling it in my body and going, okay, now I've been sitting down too long. I'm in it sort of mentally, and when your head's so in something, you forget that you're tensing all these different parts of your body. So my usual morning routine is to go walking. Do that almost every morning, unless it's really terrible weather here, which happens a bit in the Netherlands. But a little bit of rain's okay. They say we're not made of sugar in the Netherlands, but don't want it to be too extreme. But I was out walking the other morning, and I walked past a swing set, and it was like a bit earlier in the morning. There was no kids or anything playing there, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to get on the swing set. And so I did. I'm going to break up my morning routine a little bit, and I'm going to just go on the swing, and I'm going to swing until I'm not thinking any of the things that I was thinking before that. Just going to see what happens. And I had such a good time on the swing. People walking past me thinking, what's this woman doing? But I had just a ball, and I really felt it tangibly shifted my state. So I went from feeling this sort of like gripping, I've got things to do, I've got a to-do list to get through today, and it's tax time, and all the things. And then after that, I just felt like this wash of sort of creativity, and my thoughts were different as I was walking along. I was feeling excited about the future. So it's a really interesting sort of nuanced area, because in a way that's exploring the polarities as well, and it's doing it from that place in the body, from what's the actual feeling state that's going on. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it, to look at it. But that was a really kind of fun way to get into it for me.
Yeah, it reminds me, a past guest on my podcast once said, if you want to change your mind, change your body. And it reminds me of that there's a way that this isn't necessarily tied to polarity work, but a lot of times if our conditioned tendency is like, if we're stressed, is to march forward, it's actually the best thing to do might be to do the exact opposite and slow it down and go for a little walk outside. And I think the somatic awareness is another component that, if you want to be really, really dynamic, it's knowing like, what does overly rigid and structured feel like in my body, and what does too much spaciousness feel like in my body too. And using it as signposts to say, okay, well, what's usually my course correct out of this? So what I'm hearing from you is, when I'm too rigid, one of my best course corrects is to either A, move my body, or B, play, or maybe ideally it's to do both, right? Be on a swing set, it's evoking the joy and maybe probably that inner child playful energy, and then you can come back to the same things that your mind was ruminating on with a completely fresh perspective and new lens. And I can really relate to that too. That's been a large part of my inner work the past couple of years. Is there's a way in which, for me, I'm not going to do we, I'm going to say I, and there's a way in which when the chips are all down and I'm feeling stressed and work feels like it's really pulling me in, that I double down and say, I just need to get this done, keep grinding. So then eventually I will be able to finally relax when my whole list is cleared. And that's the slippery slope for me that actually points me now to, Mike, go take a 5-minute walk and clear your head. Don't listen to a podcast. Don't do anything productive in that time. Just clear your head. And that allows me to be a lot clearer when I revisit whatever it is that I'm working on too. I think it's very common for people who are driven to bring this back to polarities, to not really channel their inner couch potato, let's say. That there's real wisdom in the, let's just slow it down, man. Let's rest. Let's relax here.
Mm.
Uh, and I've always identified with being the achiever, the one who gets shit done, rather than the person who sometimes it's time for a break. Let's give ourselves the grace of relaxation and rest.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I recognize it in myself. So this, like, it's almost like I have to get to a certain point before I'm allowed to do something nice for myself, before I'm allowed to take care of myself in some way. I definitely recognize that. And the switch that I've tried to make there for myself is, instead of going, I can do all the hard work and then rest, it's I'm going to do this, and then when I feel the resistance, I'm going to go and do something different. So it's not necessarily about rest. I mean, it all depends as well if you really have to get something done, or if it's just like the story that you're telling yourself is that you have to get something done. And we need to discern that for ourselves in the moment. But just playing with this state change thing, I think can be really, really helpful, and just challenging those automatic thoughts, those automatic stories that we are telling. And just on a point with the somatic exercises as well. And there was something I learned in a class. I'm trying to even think what the topic of the class was. It was a couple of years ago during the start of the sort of COVID lockdowns, when we're all Zooming all day, every day. But it was an exercise where we had to take up as much space sort of sideways as we could, really stretch out, arms and legs as wide as we could. I'm attached via a cord here, otherwise I'd do it. But really stretch it, take out as much room as we possibly could, to the point where it's as uncomfortable as you can get, and then do the opposite. And really stretch it. How can you be as narrow as possible? And then what actually feels comfortable in the middle there? It's like, what's the middle point of taking up as much space as you can and as little as you can? What feels good? What feels like it's like your comfortable, natural, normal state? And you can do it the same the other way as well, sort of stretching up as high as you possibly can, and then like crouching down on the ground and get as low and small as you possibly can, and then coming back to a mid state. It's like, okay, yeah. And it helps to just bring some awareness over these natural tendencies that we have. And just to loop back to where you were at the start of this conversation as well, talking about, okay, if I'm an awkward person, how do I feel? And you notice like this contraction, this coming in. And so if there's a subconscious dialogue there about feeling awkward, probably the thing that our body's going to do is be small. And so just getting really, really mindful and aware of what is happening in our body in that way, it's helping to work with those internal polarities as well. It's helping to work with the narratives. It's like either getting at the mind through the body or the body through the mind. And there's more than one way to reach Rome. So it's such an interesting field to play with, and I think that is a good word for it. Like playing with the polarities. What happens if I approach my work in a really masculine, driven, get things done kind of way? What happens if I'm a little more nourishing and spacious, and like you say, create that container, but then allow myself to flow and just let the words come out, and just seeing what works well in different contexts. I think there's so much opportunity to really explore.
I love that exercise. And just yesterday in a course I'm in, we did something very similar, where it was exaggerating the tightness, like really clenching, and then just like allowing yourself to rest and kind of just wide open, and then like what feels good in between. And I know that we're coming towards close here, but I think another thing to maybe invite in here is, when you're not sure, for me, it's still very clunky sometimes. I don't know what's being asked or being called of me. What I find really helpful is to just take the empathic guess. Meaning, if someone is venting, you can ask, are you wanting me to listen, or do you want me to help you solve the problem in some way? People are usually really smart about saying, this is what I want and need right now, if you are really attempting at connection there. So I think there's, on one hand, it could be really helpful to just know internally what's being called of me, but relationally, if we just ask and are not so tied to being right about something, in the same way that qualities aren't a lot of times inherently good or bad, it's just the meaning we make of it. Being wrong about the guess is also not good or bad. It's if you're sincerely trying to meet the moment where it is, then usually good things happen in my experience. So I think that that could be a really helpful. I found polarity work to be intimidating and intellectual when I came into it, but just understanding that both are true at the same time is really what I wanted to accomplish in this conversation, and I think we did a great dance around that.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I love that you brought that in at the end here around the relational piece. That's so important to remember that other people are having their experience of their polarity as well, right? And sometimes it's going to be like we're clashing, and sometimes it's gonna be, you know, it's going to be nice. It's gonna work well. And opening our mouths to put some language around it can sometimes help. I think especially in the context of a professional relationship, maybe in some of your closer personal relationships, you start to get a bit of a feeling, but even then it always helps to get that clarification so that those around you feel seen and heard, and you're in tune with what's going on instead of always needing to guess. But I think really keeping that in mind is important as well, and knowing that we're not static beings. It's that beautiful saying that no man steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same man and it's not the same river. And just remembering that about ourselves, but also about every other person that we meet. Everybody's doing their dance, doing their thing, and it could be that they feel like a completely different person on a different day, or within the same day, within the same moment even. So it is a dance. It is a dance. So I think that's a beautiful invitation to well, offer that to myself, to you, to our viewers watching, to play with these ideas, and you know, all in the aim of getting to understand yourself better and understanding others better. And in some way, those two things are the same anyway. So it all sort of blows up to the macro, shrinks down to the micro. So yeah, I love that you brought that in.
Beautiful. That's a perfect place to close. I think you already put a beautiful ribbon on it. So nothing to add. Thanks for jamming with me as always. This was a very fruitful, meaningful conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's watching along too. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.